Hi everyone, and welcome to our third month of the Coaches and Professionals program. This month we're going to cover a really important topic that I'm really excited about, and I hope you are too. Kind of making mental health a priority in your athletic department and how to have that conversation and work with your student athletes and work with administration to really make sure that this is a priority for your department. So if you guys want to introduce each other one by one, that'd be great, and then we can start the conversation. So Adam, do you want to start?
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Adam Guenther. I'm an academic coordinator assistant at Syracuse University focusing on football. So great to be here today.
Brittany, do you want to go?
I'm Brittany James. I'm the director of sports medicine and an assistant athletic director at North Central College in Naperville.
And Dawn.
Hi, my name is Dawn Lundin. I'm a registered dietitian and owner of Restore Ease Dietetics, which is a nutrition private practice that focuses on mental health and sports nutrition.
Perfect. So we have a lot of different perspectives for this, which I'm really excited about. We have the medical and the dietitian kind of perspective and the student success perspective, all within administration kind of. So, and then I have the perspective of coach as well. So this should be a very good conversation. So Brittany, I'll start with you. Why do you think it's important that athletic departments make mental health initiatives kind of a priority and place a significant emphasis on prioritizing mental health?
I think the numbers and statistics show us that it's an important part of the lives of everyone, from our student athletes to our coaches to anybody who's in the support system or within the school itself. But I think the bigger thing is student athletes and sports in general are supposed to give us more than just what's participating on the field or court. It's supposed to be the things that we can translate into our lives going on outside of that. And so I think it's a huge initiative to make sure that this is going to be part of everyone's life going forward, and making sure that we're giving them tools to succeed and be successful and understand how they can do that in their own lives. That's what sports are for, right? I think that we all know that there's more to it than just being successful in your sport. So I think it stems from that for me.
Yeah, and I feel like coaches can a lot of the time say, like, this is going to be a life lesson. You're going to learn this for the rest of your life. And we think a lot about those on the field, on the court kind of lessons, and we don't think about taking care of yourself and navigating it kind of lessons. Adam, do you think that this conversation should be started by athletes, by coaches, by administrators, by everyone? And who do you think has the most impact by starting that conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think this really has to be a topic that's addressed at all the different levels. Um, as an administrator, it's important that we have the knowledge and that we have the resources to be successful working with our student athletes on their mental health, making sure that it's integrated as part of, sports medicine, the diet, nutrition, athletic training, all of that. But the student athletes are going to be the ones that are telling us, hey, I really need to focus on time management, or I need to focus on anxiety or test taking strategies, or, hey, we've had a lot of impact of suicide or stuff, or, working at Syracuse football, we've been having conversations about grief because of the murders at the University of Virginia, their football team, right? So if I want to talk about, mental health when it comes to anxiety, but all they want to do is talk about, like, is it okay for me as a football player to grieve about people that I may have gone on recruiting visits with? Or we have coaches that used to just were at Virginia last year coaching those same guys. Like, how do we help those coaches grieve if we're not focusing on it? So it really has to come down to what is the most timely topic, and are we listening to our constituents about what issues we need to help address them, and connect them with those resources.
I love that. So kind of, and tell me if I'm wrong, kind of getting a plan and having a plan in place, but then being willing to navigate that plan for what student athletes need the most.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to be prepared and just know that, going into, maybe the new academic year, that you're like, okay, we really need to hit time management early on, August, September, maybe bring in a speaker about, test taking strategies, et cetera, in October. But hey, if something comes up, like if we have a mental health crisis, or, an event that happened on campus, that's going to impact our student athletes, and we're going to have to pivot. So it's important to, as an administrator, know what the resources are on campus, what are the resources in the conference, who do we have connections with, so that we are not fumbling, I guess, to use a football term, when it comes to having to pivot, last second when something that's unforeseen comes up and we need to address something that's more timely than what we have on our docket. Because if we just pretend that it didn't happen, then that just makes us look negligent of, well, this happened, but we're going to glaze over it and just move on like nothing happened, because that really can isolate and make people feel like we don't care if we're just kind of going back to business as usual.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I know for us, we talked about last year when the JMU catcher Lauren Burnett lost her life. We sat down with our team and just talked about it. And we hadn't planned to do that, obviously, but that conversation was very impactful, and it was a very open room. And I think it opened up a lot of vulnerability and a lot of trust within our team and our coaching staff and our players. So I completely agree with the kind of doing what's most important for them and what they need in that moment. So Dawn, how would you start this conversation? What resources would you kind of bring to the table, and how would you tell administration, hey, this is important to us and this should be important to you too, and this is why?
That's an excellent question, and something that I've been navigating at some of the schools that I currently work with. One of the things that I hear come up a lot is money, right? Like, where are we going to find the funds to be able to have these mental health professionals, whether on, accessible to our students, to have them on retainer or whatever that looks like. And I think it has to start with policies and procedures, just like we do on every level of the university, is really having a policy for each of those types of mental health concerns. And in my expertise is eating disorders. And kind of like what Adam said is having a policy, but also knowing when to pivot. And we had a student athlete die by suicide in April of this year. And in our campus community, we also had a student in the elementary school and also in the middle school in our campus community also die by suicide. And so it's also reminding ourselves, like was already mentioned, that things that are happening even outside of athletics within our campus communities are affecting our student athletes and the student body. And what I'm seeing is a big cry for help from our student athletes or our student body in general. And these changes maybe the student body is not seeing the efforts that is being made by administration, and they see that as nothing's being done. And I think that can be really hard for those that are struggling to say, look, like there's this big outcry for help, and what is the athletic department doing? What is the university doing as a whole? And what is the community doing as a whole?
I think that's a great point. And I think your point about it immediately made me think of kind of and we talk about it at THO, kind of the first thing we ask our campus captains to do is to get together resources on their campus. And a lot of them come back and they say, oh, well, we have issues getting into the counseling center. And, there's a 2-week wait. And like in talking to some people at the school where I work at, they say, yeah, that can be a case at some schools, but if you have the right resources and the right policies, like you were talking about, in place, then that isn't an issue that we may face. So, and in talking to some of the student athletes, they didn't see that because they didn't know about the policies, and they didn't know, oh, if this happens, then there's this policy in place that will help me get the help that I need. And they just kind of hear other perspectives. And I really like the point you made about money. I really did, because I think that is such a barrier that a lot of people think is bigger than it is, if that makes sense. I think there's a lot of resources, and that's something we're trying to do with this program, is give resources to administrators, coaches, professionals, to be able to give back to their kids and support their student athletes in a more holistic way. And I just really hope that more of those resources come out and are able to be helpful. So Adam, I'll jump to you for this next question. What does your athletic department do in its approach with mental health initiatives? So what works well for you? What maybe is something that you have a passion project for and is coming up and you really want to kind of dig into, or what hasn't worked?
Yeah, so I'm relatively new to Syracuse, so I don't want to speak too broadly about what has and has not happened, just because I'm relatively new. But we have a social work graduate student that works in our student athlete development office, that has done a lot with our mental health committee. So we have a mental health committee that's made up of a number of different folks in our department, as well as the last couple Mondays or every other Monday, we've had a mental health Monday. We had one today and it was really good. It was pizza and pups or something like that. And so we had pizza over the lunch hour, as well with therapy dogs that came in. Right before our Thanksgiving break, we had friendship bracelet making, gratitude cards. If you wanted to give like someone that's helped you in the last week or so, you can make them a little card to talk to them about how much that gesture meant to them. But I think that not just at Syracuse, but at other institutions I've worked at, mental health has to be something that isn't performative, and it's not something that you just have like an event. It has to be something that is part of everything from like onboarding to that summer bridge program that a lot of academic athletic programs do. It really has to be something that's incorporated throughout. Like I do a lot of learning strategy meetings with the student athletes that are in my caseload. Like that has to be something about talking about time management, anxiety, test taking strategies. It can't be something until we wait till like in our athlete speaker that we talk about anxiety and performance issues. We have to have that be something that is consistently talking about, because in the same way that we're not going to talk about stretching until after you've pulled a hamstring, why are we talking about mental health after we've had a mental health issue, or you're already like so anxious that you want to drop out of classes, or you can't function because you're in a depressive hole and you can't get into counseling for 2 weeks, right? So mental health, like I'm sure a lot of the people on the call know, is something that needs to be more integrated with the rest of our work, because you don't necessarily see someone waiting until they have a broken leg to go see the sports medicine physician.
Yeah, I love that point. And I love what you said about having a Master of Social Work student involved with that mental health committee. Do you guys have a Master of Social Work master's program?
I would assume so. It's either that or it's through like counseling. But I know that she's billed as like a social work student, so I'm assuming we have that in our College of Human Dynamics. I believe it's what it's called here. But it's a relatively new position. I believe this is the first year that we've had it. Syracuse has been fortunate enough to kind of grow our assistant program and our internship program to more of the student athlete development side of the house. Previously, my understanding is that it's been mostly the learning specialty, the academic counseling aspect that I do now. And so I think as we've had more staff in that area, we've been able to specialize and focus on more issues instead of just the broad SAC and graduation ceremonies and banquets of recognition. We're being able to dive a little bit more deeper in it, and we're really fortunate to have our assistant AD Mark Trumbo kind of lead that effort, who's really big into student athlete development on the national scale.
It's funny that you mentioned his name because he spoke at an event that I was at. But I kind of love that, because in one sense, you're a Power 5 Division I that, you just said has resources and are fortunate to have those staffers, where if you have your smaller schools, that's still a great way to get, students in a master's program involved and also give back to athletics and kind of have that circle going. So having a Master of Social Work student, Master of Counseling, somebody in the counseling center who's maybe getting hours, maybe doing drop-in hours with your student athletes. That's also a great touch point to kind of get your counseling center involved with athletics. I know that's something that our school is really, really prioritizing this year, is getting the counseling center and athletics really, really aligned. Because we aren't fortunate enough to have a lot of the kind of sports performance resources or sports psychologists or, counseling specific to athletics that some other schools may have. So I think there's a lot of ways that different schools use different kind of positions and different processes that, even though it may not look the same for your school, it can still impact another school in a positive way. So, Britt, how do you think that the role of student athletes, coaches, support staff, administrators, how do you think that that can be shown by each? So we kind of touched on before, like the student athletes may not see what's going on behind the scenes and how we're advocating for this change. How do you think that we can show that while we're working behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's a big question, I think. And hearing everyone else speak, right? I'm definitely one of those institutions that doesn't have those resources. And I think that's one of the hardest things to show student athletes and your peers is this work is being put on individuals at an institution that already have a full workload. And when you know this is really important, you're trying to figure out how to already get it into a full academic calendar that you do it justice and you find other ways to be flexible, right? We can't predict when certain teams or certain individuals might need us to step in and kind of pull at something else. So how do you show them this? I think it's being super transparent with that. Here are the struggles we're facing, but we're looking at really creative ways to solving that, right? Like I don't have money to throw at this problem, but I can send letters to, fortunately, Naperville is right next to Chicago. I've got a lot of people that I can reach out to and say, hey, can you come speak to, this group, or what would you pose as, some people who would want to talk about this issue to our student athletes. Do you have any students that are willing to come in? Because we don't have those master's programs. We do have them in nutrition, and we do work with them. So showing that, saying, hey, we are working with these groups. We're not working with these groups. Also hearing from the students has been really helpful for us. One of the things that, we assume that we know what's interested or what they're interested in, or maybe what their struggles are. But we also didn't have this in our professional development either. So trying to say that my experience, 15 years ago is not the same that is currently happening. So not taking that for granted and being involved in those conversations, having forums with a bunch of different people, not just student athletes, but different groups on campus and how they're feeling about certain things. So I think it's being transparent about the process, it's being transparent about the policies that you have, and about your resources, and then not settling for that. It's not an excuse to say we don't have the money. It's not an excuse to say we don't have an appointment for 2 weeks. It's, we might not have an appointment for 2 weeks. Here's what we can do in the meantime to get you where you need to be. And here's how to problem solve. So I think it's the unique problem solving that you need coaches, student athletes, general student population, other administrators. We have a lot of help from our student affairs programming. Res Life does a lot of things for us that, we can be like, oh, wow, this is what's really going on in the community. But there's also other community members that we can reach out to and kind of ask for assistance or creative ideas for problem solving.
I love that, because I feel like, all those student government and Res Life and all of those kind of organizations on campus could be working towards the same goal. And obviously you could have overlap and can collaborate. And I love that you mentioned transparency and that. And I think it kind of gives us strength to everything that you're doing, and it allows the student athletes, like you said, to kind of come in and have their input and have that voice, and for administration and student athletes to really collaborate and work together towards that end goal instead of not being on the same page. So
if I could just add something real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think Brittany did a great job talking about Residence Life, and that was actually my previous work was as a hall director. And so one way that I kind of have been able to bring in a lot of education and opportunity to the athletic department here is bringing some of those resources, because hall directors and RAs are typically the ones that are going to interact with mental health crisis at like 2 a.m. in the morning. And a lot of them are trained in programs such as Mental Health 101 or QPR, suicide prevention training. So if that is something that your campus offers for RAs, is there a way that we can get those people trained at the same time for team captains or SAC exec members and stuff? And so really trying to not have to spend more money or have to reinvent the wheel, but knowing that these group of students have this training, is there a way that they can sit in on that training and not have to take up counseling's, time to go through the training twice? And so that's kind of where I've been trying to really connect main campus with athletics, because oftentimes it can be kind of that two towers aspect of athletics wants to do its own thing, and main campus wants it to do their own thing. Like, how can we connect those two areas of campus so it's not so siloed?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We actually had that conversation as a staff too of the QPR, and other departments are doing that. So how do we do that? And I really love that point of kind of not reinventing the wheel. I think that's really important. Dawn, so are there topics in this conversation, and I think I know your answer already, but are there topics in this conversation that you think are very important that are missing? So I think, and from my coaching perspective, I think that anxiety is being talked about a lot more because there's performance anxiety. And so it can affect your performance on the court, on the field, whatever it may be, but also, mindfulness and meditation can help you throughout the rest of your life. It can help you navigate hard situations and everything. So that's starting to be talked about more without, the taboo or the kind of stigma around it. Do you think there are topics that still have that stigma and that we're not talking about enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of going into the anxiety piece, like I work with a lot of athletes who suffer from like pre-race anxiety or pre-game or pre-match anxiety, and just kind of normalizing that feeling. I'm an endurance athlete and I still get nervous before I run a race or compete in a race. And I'm a lot older than some of these athletes are. And so naming that, and then also recognizing, like in my role, we name it and then we recognize how it affects our ability to fuel for that match or race or event. And we come up with a plan. So not that we're trying to shove that anxiety down or pretend like it's not going to show up, because it is. It shows us time and time again, right? So, we've talked about some of these like policies for universities and athletic departments, but also helping these athletes come up with kind of like an individual policy to help them walk through some of these mental health struggles. And one of the things that I feel like is missing, to further answer your question, we concentrate on athletes with eating disorders, but I think it can be helpful to even identify like what is disordered eating, and can we intervene before something becomes a diagnosable eating disorder. And a lot of the times it's the education piece, right? Like our athletes see nutrition education all over social media and the news, and a lot of the information is either not accurate or it doesn't pertain to student athletes. And so when we can bring in the educational piece as well to these athletes to say, this is how you should be feeling your body, they can go to a reliable resource instead of relying on somebody from TikTok or Instagram. And so I think that, not only talking about some of these, disordered eating, anxiety, and how it affects athletic performance, but also, where are those reliable resources? Who is a reliable source of mental health information, nutrition information? Who should we go to talk about mindfulness and meditation? And I think that that's just, it's talking more about how we can help support these students.
I love that answer. And I love the difference that you drew between how we do talk about eating disorders in athletes, but not disordered eating. And I know I've talked to a lot of athletes and former teammates, and we all said to each other, we had no idea that, not eating before practice or some of the habits that we had around food and athletics wasn't normal. And it was just because this is how it is because you're an athlete. And so I think that's definitely a very important conversation to have, because it's just nobody questions it almost. And it's a stigma and nobody's talking about it because it's just accepted. And I love what you mentioned about social media too. Do you have any resources off the cuff that you would kind of recommend for fueling and nutrition for athletics? Maybe like your top 3, if you can think of them.
Yeah, I really like Jess, the sports RD. Her name is Jessica Isaacs. And Riley, I'm trying to think of her last name. My 3-year-old has my phone, but she works with a lot of soccer players. And Jessica works with a lot of her main focus is basketball, but there's lots of sports dietitians. Another one is that I really like is Lauren Link. I believe she's at Purdue. Again, just some great resources, sports dietitians. There's many of them out there, and some of them have, more of a unique focus, like a sports focus. I know a lot of my colleagues in the Collegiate Sports Dietitian Association, the CPSDA, a lot of them are football dietitians. So Adam, I thought of that when you said you're within football. But yeah, there's resources out there, and being able to give those to athletes. And again, I work with a lot of athletes with eating disorders, and a lot of athletes come to me because they're like, I know you're an athlete. I know you get it. And I work really hard to try to keep movement a part of the equation in their recovery. And that's very different from my eating disorder dietitian colleagues who don't have experience as an athlete or working with athletes. And so sometimes they think like, wow, I'm not going to get to practice anymore or compete anymore. And I think when they're educated, right, that like if we can identify these signs of disordered eating or eating disorders, we can really help you with this issue so you can return to sport and you can show up better fueled for practice. You can be 100% focused because you're not having eating disorder thoughts, and you can show up fueled so you actually have energy to participate and to benefit from whatever your coach has planned for that day.
I love that so much. So then kind of moving into, we've had the conversation and we're looking to make positive changes within a department. So, Adam, what are some tangible changes? And I think we kind of already kind of talked about this, but what are some tangible changes that you could make kind of right away, or ones that would be impactful and may take a little bit longer, to further prioritize that kind of mental health piece within an athletics department? And what do you think is the most important first step?
Yeah, so I think, something that's really more immediate, easier to kind of incorporate with an athletic department is really just having all the staff just kind of know what are the different signs of different common mental health illnesses, whether it be anxiety, depression, suicide ideation. Not to say that any one of those illnesses has a stereotypical, disposition, but if you notice a mood change, or someone was like X, but now they are not like X, that's a red flag for a lot of different things. And something that we do here at Syracuse is we kind of have a flow chart of like if it's life threatening, you're possible of harm of yourself or others, this is the path you take, these are the people you contact. We have like a liaison that kind of works between different units in the athletic department, within and without, within and outside of the athletic department. So they're the ones that coordinate with or counseling staff. They're the ones that coordinate with, I would assume, dean of students, housing, provost's office, etc. And so I think that, having some of that risk management, some of that like, what can we do before we have to know it type of training, I think is important. But I think, something that's a little bit down the road and more difficult for a lot of people to understand, knowing that athletics is becoming more professionalized and coaches have a higher, expectation of winning. I'll say, at least at the division I'm at, is, trying to understand that it's okay to lose, and that if you have a player that's playing at 70%, but they're only, doing 70%, 30% of the time, that's not as good as if they were doing, 50% half the time, right? There's a maximization curve that you get. And so really understanding that if you want to think about improving your department culture, depending on we have to lose this game to win the next game. You have to understand that you got to pull some players. You have to lose this game knowing that you're going to have them sit out for a week to get their mental health space going, get them into counseling, get them, in the right, right space. Because if you're not hitting everything at 100%, you're really not maximizing where you're going to be. Because having 100% of you at during one game, but you're not doing well for the other 11 to keep active football, then you're 1-11. But if you're doing 50-50, maybe you're looking at 6-6, and that's bowl eligible, and that's a coach keeping their job. So it really comes down to understanding that sometimes you got to take the short loss to get the long-term win.
I love that, kind of looking more at the journey in the long term and being willing to do what it takes so that there's long-term success instead of looking at the short-term kind of wins. And like you kind of said, like every game, there's now a pressure with the professionalization of coaches that can feel like every game matters, where in reality, if you lose one game, it's okay. And I love that you made that point. So Brittany, kind of moving into coaches and administration, how do you think, like, what are some tangible changes that we can make for coaches and for administration to prioritize their mental health?
Again, I'll stick with the word transparency and education, right? You have to be educated on the process of what to do just like, Adam was saying, understanding what the school's procedures are. Who do you call? Who do you talk to? What's expected of you as a coach and administrator in those situations? How do you demonstrate it though? How do you my institution has 27 different sports. How do we make 27 different head coaches create a culture that feeds into the bigger athletic culture, that feeds into the institution's culture, that we are empowered to talk about mental health issues, that we can go to one another and know how to respond in a way that is supportive and empowering to take action? And I think that's kind of you have to start at understanding how to do that, especially when you may not have felt that as an individual. So understanding the resources that the institution has. I think that was one of the first questions that we asked. This summer, there were a lot of things going on with student athletes, and knowing that our student athletes were coming in craving more knowledge on what our campus was going to offer them as support-wise for mental health, whether they were student athletes or not. What can we do, and what are our, what do we have as students, or as staff, as coaches, as faculty, right? Everybody wants to know, because everybody's coming out of a pandemic. Everybody's coming into this social justice climate, right? Everybody brings this with them. And so how are we top down supported? And then how can we in turn that? So I think understanding and having that basic education on what your campus offers, but then also being empowered to say, if they don't offer something you need, say something. Because maybe it's just something that we don't know. Maybe HR doesn't know that the staff doesn't get this presentation that the faculty get, and understand that they have this resource for debrief. Or maybe the person that used to lead debriefing after, something happens, like a big loss or a grief period for maybe one individual or multiple individuals, they left. How are we filling that? That's important. Someone has to push that drive to fill that position, because we are using it and it is a resource we need. So I think education and transparency on that are super easy to do. I think it's really easy to be transparent. I think it's really easy to help coaches feel empowered to say something. And then when they're acting that way, that trickles down to their team. And so the team then has that culture of, we're empowered, we're educated, and we're here to support people. And if we see a need, we say something, as opposed to being like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to draw attention to someone who's struggling with grief or who's struggling with the classroom, right? Because if my teammate's struggling in the classroom, maybe my coach won't let them practice. And that might negatively impact our relationship. But if we know that that's an expectation, and that's something that's handled in a really professional and supportive manner, then we know that that's not the case. And we can feel like we can be really great teammates to each other. And I think, again, that's a trickle down effect.
I love that you talked about the culture of your team going to the coaches, going to your department, going to the university's culture. So with that kind of more macro level approach, what do you think is a more micro? So like a coach going to their practice, how do you think coaches can be more tangible about showing athletes that they are prioritizing it at practice? So like that's advocating for change and for these resources, but what can they do if they walk into practice today and want to kind of show, okay, today I'm prioritizing this aspect of your mental health?
I think asking those questions and being sincere about it, not just assuming that because someone's not going 100% in the drill, it's because, they're not focused or they don't want to be here, but that because something else might be going on, but being genuine in that, having structured time into that. I think the way you start your season is really important, right? Coming right out with your team and saying, look, I am concerned about these things and I want to be supportive. So if I ask, how are you doing? Or I've noticed X, what's going on? I mean to have a sit down conversation, or I mean to have this conversation with you guys. But also being proactive. Let's schedule stuff with our mental health or a counseling center or other people on campus or outside sources already, right? That way it's not pinpointing something that may have just happened. We do stuff with relationship knowledge. We bring in our counselors. It's not because, as athletic trainers, we hear a lot of things about relationships that are happening at the collegiate level that we may be worried about or want to say something about, but preemptively talking about that, right? So that no one on a team or no one on a certain group feels targeted about that, but we're going to preemptively go have those conversations. I think when you as a coach set those up already before the season even starts and it's just habitual, it becomes way easier to really have that question, be like, hey, something's, just seems off with you. What's going on? And when it doesn't come at the expense of the student athletes playing time or something like that, where they don't fear that retribution for just being human, I think that goes a long way. So I think being sincere in those things with coaching goes a long way.
The phrase that you just said, so that they don't fear retribution for simply being human, I think is such a good point. I think that's such a good way to put it. I'm just soaking that in right now. So Dawn, kind of from your perspective, what are some good kind of outside resources that athletic departments, maybe if they're lacking in a certain area and want to get outside help, what do you think is either a good way for them to go about that, or to search for that outside help, or what areas do you think they may need help with outside of their department?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can speak to one of the universities that I work with. They don't have a sports dietitian like on staff. It's a Division II school. And so a lot of the coaches think that because we have a dietitian in the dining hall or within the dining services, that it's like comparing apples and apples. And, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can take a dietitian who's working in the kitchen and put them up in front of a team of athletes, or put them in front of an athlete with an eating disorder and expect those experiences to be all the same. So, looking at what's available at the university, and then if there's not a sports dietitian, and then specifically a dietitian with eating disorder in sport expertise and experience, like where can we refer out to if we need to? Also looking at within our small community, we also have the same issue with not only student athletes, but also students on campus, that it's difficult to get into the counseling services center if you have a chronic or say like a diagnosable mental health condition. They see it more for like short-term support. And within our community, we have extensive, like 6-month plus wait lists to get these students or student athletes in. So what other resources are out there? So it, may also be like a sports psychologist, eating disorder specific therapist, things like that. And it may even look at treatment facilities for eating disorders in sport, or even looking at some of those other mental health conditions like anxiety or depression, because as we see, more athletes struggling with mental health conditions as a whole, sometimes it is, granted, sometimes it's usually the last thing we want to happen, but sometimes athletes do need to be removed from campus to prioritize their mental health. And when we can be kind of like armored with resources and come to the athlete with options, like there is no better way to support an athlete than to say, hey, I see you struggling. you are not alone and you are worthy of support. And here are your options. And, the parents also want to hear that, the teammates that this, student may have been living with. Everyone wants to know there is help for this person, because you never know who may also need support, who may be onlooking to this situation or experience.
I love those points. And I love the phrase that you said, armored with resources. I think that's a really great way to put it. And the idea that you don't have to just look in your campus community for those resources. So like you said, if something's lacking and if you need specific help somewhere, don't be afraid to ask outside of your campus community. Or if you have something within your campus community that may not be as impactful as you need it to be with your student athletes, asking for that specific help. So kind of, moving into the student athlete aspect of it, SAC, I think, is a really important part of this conversation and has a really powerful role and has a great opportunity to be an impact kind of mover shaker in this transition or any conversation that's happening in an athletic department. So Adam, what role do you think that SAC kind of can play in this? And do you think they should be the role of a mediator? Should they be the one starting the kind of conversation, or how can they best go between an athletic department and the student athlete body?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that if you at an athletic department are going to have any type of student athlete focused like groups or meetings, it's going to typically be at least SAC. And I think that, using how SAC is here at Syracuse is we have like a subcommittee of members that are part of our mental health committee. And I think that's great. And I know that they do a lot with our mental health Mondays and other programs that we do here at Syracuse, but kind of generalizing it to the rest of, the campuses across the, the states is you can't have students be the sole driving of mental health resources. And so it's also important to say like, hey, what do you guys want us to help you on? Or what are you seeing that your teammates need us to focus on? But also knowing that these 18 to 24-ish year olds now with COVID, eligibility years, what are the topics that they're, reluctant to bring up or, maybe not know how to talk about? Dawn talked about eating disorders or, problematic eating, but also, I do a lot with substance misuse disorders and stuff. So like, are they going to be able to talk about, that, 60% of the softball team is, heavily vaping, or, the football team is, getting blackout drunk every weekend. These are problems that, some campuses have with their teams throughout the nation. And so those aren't going to be stuff that they're going to want to, snitch on their teammates saying like, hey, the hockey team or the swim team has a drinking problem. Let's talk about, how we can support them as teammates, but also, thinking about as coaches, like, is that something that they're turning a blind eye to? Like, if it's not practice and it's not a me, it's not my problem. Is that really in the best support of student athletes' holistic health? And so I think it's really important to have it be a partnership. So, perhaps when you, elect new student athletes for exec for the coming year, maybe you have someone talk to them about like, what are their goals for the next academic year? Or, what are the mental health goals? What do you want us to focus on? Knowing that priorities will shift and change, like I said earlier about, stuff comes up, but it's kind of about what does the admin want? What do the coaches want? What do the student athletes want? And where are the commonalities that we have? And then where are the stuff that this is where coaches want us to focus on, but this is what student athletes want us to focus on? Where can we find the middle road, that third path?
I love that. And I think that's so important. And I love that you kind of said, going for administrators and coaches going into SAC, kind of, what do you want our help on? And it just gives them a voice to be able to, and like I said, I think SAC is a really important part of that. And I love that you mentioned the mental health committee. I think that's definitely something that's, I don't want to say taking off, but I think it's becoming a much more common part of SAC. A lot of SAC advisors, I'm a SAC advisor, and a lot of SAC advisors that I've talked to have said that they're starting mental health committees, or they're, having some sort of a focus within SAC for mental health initiatives. So Brittany, you know, they can come up with these ideas. How do you think it's best for them to put it in action? Because I think a lot of the times, like, they have such great ideas, but then sometimes those ideas can compound into more ideas instead of kind of taking that first step. So how do you think they should go about it, or who do you think they should go to help them take that first step?
I mean, I think it's just like Adam said, it's important to find out where they want their role to be and what they want to be. Do they want to be the drivers? Do they need, you know, co-pilots that are going to really push? Do they need to be someone on top of them all the time? And knowing your leaders in SAC is important too, right? If all of my really outspoken, driven leaders are fall sport athletes, they might need a lot more help with those initiative and those goals in the fall than they do in the late winter, spring, when they can really kind of take a step inward and really focus on that. But I think that it's important to say, you know, little steps, remembering how to function. It sounds really silly, but you know, how we actually write down goals and measure them and you know, make them obtainable. We're talking about high achievers, people that want to do big things and that feel these are really important things to them. Small things can really turn into big things. So let's do some small things first. Let's make sure that we can get people to really attend this. Let's find out something that we really want to do. We don't need to do 8 things. We need to do 2 things. And I think it's driving that, helping them really shape those things so that they get wins in those, right? Because if we do a really big event or we do something and it falls short because there's too much going on and we can't do it all, people get discouraged or people don't want to do it again. And you know, coming from a smaller campus, that really drives, you know, you're a student athlete, but your presence is much bigger on campus when, you know, there's only 3,000 students. So making sure that you get those wins, that you're there to help them, but also refocus them sometimes. And I think that that's important to get that cue from them.
I love the focus that you placed on that in helping them get wins. Because like you were saying, I think they can, you know, have, like you said, have those 8 kind of things that they want to do. But if they do 2 of them and win at them, then that's going to be more impactful than trying to do all 8 at the same time. So I love that kind of focus point, moving towards the goals of SAC and actually getting something actionable on the table. So Dawn, you mentioned kind of funding and money earlier. So if your SAC has funding, how do you think that they approach that conversation of using that funding towards, you know, an event for mental health, and kind of what would be the best way for them to approach that conversation so that it's kind of a win-win for both, you know, SAC and student athletes and administration?
Yeah, kind of stemming off of what Brittany was saying, I think this generation of students, I also teach within our university, so I see them on 2 different levels, in the classroom and out of the classroom, is reminding students at times of the big picture, right? So like Brittany said, like kind of like not doing 8 things, but 2 things, but like not just creating an event to have an event and to put mental health on it and do something for mental health, but what's actually going to contribute to the student, you know, the athletics department and the student athlete body to continue to foster a sense of mental health wellness within the athletics department, within the campus as a whole. And so really, you know, from a funding aspect of just kind of being smart with those dollars, because funds are limited. And so like, how can, you know, is there something that can impact the student athletes, but can also contribute to the mental health of the campus as a whole? And it kind of goes back to what Adam was saying about including those social worker graduate students within, you know, like a mental health committee. You know, it could be, you know, policies. One of the things that I've found as a really good resource for myself, and it's not geared towards mental or towards healthcare professionals, was mental health first aid. And so is that something that maybe if student athletes are identifying that they would like the athletics department to be more knowledgeable of mental health conditions, that specific training is based off of community members, right? So how could a community member help intervene with someone who's experiencing a mental health crisis? And working with individuals with mental health conditions and being a daughter of a mother who has bipolar depression, I learned a lot in that training. And so we have individuals who have been trained and are able to facilitate those trainings. And so including, the athletics department, counseling services are already involved, but what other areas and how can we use those funds to really help the students feel supported, I feel like is kind of a great lens to look at it as from a financial aspect.
Yeah, so kind of focusing more on long-term impact rather than one event that may be a hit, but what happens afterwards kind of thing. So I really love that perspective and that advice. So wrapping up, what would be kind of your biggest piece of advice to an administrator, a coach, student athletes? Kind of, you can pick who you want to talk to in this, but especially for administrators and coaches and professionals, what would be your biggest piece of advice as they navigate this? So Brittany, I'll start with you.
Oh man, that's a big one to start off with. I think I'll agree with whatever Adam and Dawn say as well. But again, I think coming from my perspective at a smaller Division III institution, and also someone that runs a department within a department, that focus, right? My focus is on the health and safety of the student athletes, and typically people are thinking of the physical, safety and well-being of the student athletes and driving their healthcare. So I think the biggest takeaway for me is for the institution on down to remain focused on their goal, and that's whether they are students, student athletes, or students with jobs. All these, again, they are humans that are coming to this institution, and our job is to make sure that they grow and develop and become better versions of themselves within their 4, 5, or 6 years at the institution, depending on what their study is. So for me, it's that there's life beyond sport, and let's help you find that and be successful in all that you choose to do. Because sometimes that can come abruptly to an end for a student athlete, or it's planned, right? Again, Division III, well, most of them know that in those 4 years, they're stopping that, and that must look different for them now. And that's true of Division I and Division II and NAIA as well. But I think at the focus, we need to remember that these are people that we are helping guide through something, and we want them to be able to walk away better in their understanding of how they will operate going forward, and to be happy and healthy in those choices and those decisions. So I think when you function and focus on that simple goal, it makes the other things easier, because you can always say, are we doing this because it's what we're supposed to do, or because we have to check a box, or are we doing this because at the end of the day, it's what we believe we want to do, and it's why we got into coaching, or it's why I wanted to be a teacher here, it's why I wanted to be an athletic trainer here, this is why I stay. And if it fits those things, then it becomes much easier to kind of sit around the table and have those hard discussions and realize that it's work. This isn't something that just because you want everybody to feel better and have really great resources for mental health and make everyone feel supported all the time. It's work to do those things. And so I think that it's keeping that in perspective.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Adam, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I think we've talked a lot about the different resources and the different approaches that I think, Brittany and Dawn and myself would, take and have taken. But, thinking of like some more of the marginalized groups that we have in student athletes, like oftentimes student athletes are perhaps one of the larger chunks of diversity that are added to campuses. I know, previously I worked at an institution out in the far west in South Dakota. And so a lot of our African American and Hispanic athletes were the ones on the football team or the basketball team, or any of the teams really. And so they weren't really what looked like the majority of our general student population is. So as we're talking about mental health, it's also important to, kind of think about like, how does this look like for our students of color? How does this look like for our student athletes in the LGBT community? How does this look for international students? When I was working with the athletic department as a student worker, mental health was not really necessarily where it's at today, but thinking about how open Gen Z student athletes are now, that might not be the perspective of our international student athletes, right? And so Syracuse, I believe, has an all international student athlete team. And so how does that look like when you have students from Eastern Europe and South America and Africa? How is mental health, talked about from a globalized standpoint, and recognizing that those students we might need to do a little bit more outreach to than perhaps football that typically has more domestic students.
So I kind of want to comment on both of your points. So Adam, I love that point that you make, especially about international students. I studied abroad twice, and I do love Division III because I was able to do that as a student athlete. But that's such an important part of it, because those cultural differences, and I'm using international student athletes as an example, but obviously it can apply to all different kind of communities. But the culture is different, and the conversations may be different. So kind of being willing to go all in and learn why it's different, and being willing to have those conversations in a way that those communities will be receptive to, I think is really, really important. And Brittany, when you mentioned, kind of going back to your why and why you got into coaching and why you got into administration, whatever your role may be, it made me think of, I had a coach at a convention that was speaking, and she said, make up your coaching mission statement. Why are you doing it? And that made me really think about, part of my mission statement is being able to foster that relationship of trust with my student athletes, so that if they are struggling, they feel like they can come to me and that I'm a safe space. And that trust and that kind of being able to help them grow is such a big thing for me. And so I think when I realized that as a coach and really actually asked myself, okay, why am I doing this? That it really enhanced kind of what I was doing. So I love both of your points, and I think they're very important and very maybe not talked about as much as they should be. So Dawn, do you want to bring us home here?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple final thoughts. One of them is just kind of, I think it's important from a athletic department standpoint to develop policies and procedures around different mental health conditions and crises, specifically so that individuals within the athletics department or within the community know their role. When we all know what role we have in supporting a student athlete or to helping a student athlete get through, suicide ideations or an eating disorder, it gives us all kind of like that. It's that team approach, right? Like when you know your role on the field, or like what your role is in a play or things like that, like we all have a job to do essentially, and really making sure that those policies and procedures foster not only a healthy relationship with food, but a healthy relationship with exercise. And we kind of talked a little bit about, some of these things that we hear, and yes, exercise is great for our mental health, but there are also things about sport that can impede our mental health. And so making sure that those, kind of like what Brittany was saying, when our student athletes leave our campus, what are they leaving with? Are they walking off campus and never wanting to touch their sport again? Right? Or were they using that sport to manipulate the physical appearance of their body, right? Like, how can we encourage them to have a healthy relationship with their body image, their sport, with exercise, and also with food?
I have absolutely loved this conversation, and I'm so excited for the rest of our community to get to hear this, because I think this was a really important conversation, a really impactful conversation. And I think that it's really going to help a lot of coaches and administrators and professionals navigating how best to make this change and how to, prioritize mental health, because it definitely needs to happen. So thank you all three of you for coming. And I'm really excited for this to go out. So thank you.